You're listening to episode 194 of The Secular Buddhist.
Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed.
Author Charles Fisher joins us to speak about his new book, Meditation in the Wild, Buddhism's Origin in the Heart of Nature. Contemporary practice may tend to be a bit urban. We're crowded. Most of us are in cities, and the concept of being a forest monastic is fairly distant from our experience. But how might immersion in nature affect our practice? Charlie Fisher was a professor of sociology at Brandeis University in Massachusetts for 30 years. Among other subjects, he taught his students to meditate as part of the regular curriculum. From the mid-1970s through the mid-1990s, Charlie was associated with the Insight Meditation Society. In 2007, he published a book on nature and meditation entitled Dismantling Discontent, Buddha's Way Through Darwin's World. An inadvertent heir to the Thai forest tradition, Charlie has spent long periods meditating in the woods with wild beings. Charlie lives in Woodacre, California, occasionally teaches meditation, and assists in natural history field trips. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice evolution tea shisha. And our guest today is Charles Fisher. Charlie, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
So, tell us a little bit about your background. What is it that brought you to Buddhism?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I knew very little about Buddhism. I was in my late 30s, I think, and I had a friend who had been a colleague in the university who was essentially where I taught sociology in Boston, and he was essentially fired for teaching meditation. And he kind of dropped out, and his university friends kind of disowned him for being a little strange. But he was a good friend of mine. And I remember once he kind of lived on the streets and he vanished. Years later, I found that he went off with every kind of visiting guru. And he ended up in a Zen center in Cambridge. And I was rather out of sorts at the time. And so I tracked him down to kind of ask him some questions about life. And I walked into this small Zen center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they were sitting. And I could look in the room and see them all sitting. And there he was sitting really peacefully. And I, of course, snuck out, not wanting to disturb him or anyone else. But I didn't really understand it. And somewhat later, someone gave me Suzuki Roshi's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I again read it, some of it, but it didn't make much sense to me until my father died. And the morning after my father died, I was sitting on a seawall in Florida where my father lived, just thinking about it all. I had had a very vivid dream about a Zen master dying that evening while my father was dying. So there seemed to be something in this all for me. although, again, I didn't understand very much about it until about a year later, when all the circumstances of my life came to a very distressing point. And I bumped into this man again, and he essentially read me the riot act, that even though I was quite successful and carried out things, that I ought to get my act together, and that there was a meditation retreat happening at the Insight Meditation Society a few days hence, and then I would get myself there. And lo and behold, I did, through a series of odd circumstances. One of my students was actually the registrar of the...
That was convenient.
Well, I didn't know that. I called them up, and she told me that the retreat was filled, and 10 minutes later, they called me back and said I was in it. And I think it was because of my connections. This was 1976, and I really became intensely involved in meditation. I have never sat before. I sat for a month straight, and then went off to the woods for a while and came back. And for the next 4 or 5 years, I sat probably 2 months every year. I lived near the Insight Meditation Society in a rural community halfway between Boston and Barre, Massachusetts, where when I wasn't teaching, I was growing organic veggies and things like that. And I just got very involved in meditation for the next, I guess, 40 years now almost. It's been a part of my life. But what I learned at the Insight Meditation Society had nothing to do with the forest tradition in which I became later interested. It's not that it hadn't influenced the kind of meditation that was taught there, because Jack Kornfield, who was one of the major teachers at IMS, had been a student of Ajahn Chah, the famous forest monk in Thailand, but he had come across Ajahn Chah after Ajahn Chah had settled down. And Ajahn Chah conveyed very little of his forest practice to his Western students. I don't know about his Thai students, because he felt that it was really inappropriate for them. And yet there was something in his spirit that was highly aligned with forest meditation. Anyway, I've been meditating ever since. I must say I'm a little bit more like a forest monk than I am a monastery monk. And the meditation centers, which I've been in, and there have been many now, were more like the monasteries, even if they weren't themselves monasteries, but they more encapsulated the spirit of monastic Buddhism than of the Buddhism of the wild, should we say. Anyway, that's some of how I got into meditation. It certainly has become a deep part of my life, even if the institution's not much interest to me anymore. Again, kind of in the spirit of forest monks about whom I wrote.
Charlie, one of the things that you had mentioned is that part of your start on this path had to deal with the death of your father and some of the suffering that I think came from that. And how has your practice helped you? How has that impacted the way in which you deal with the tragedies of life as they arise?
Well, the Buddha presumably began his search after coming from a life of innocence and after being exposed to disease, old age, and death. And they rattled him to such a degree that he couldn't live anymore in the life of comfort that he had grown up in. And I must say that if one looks around the world and you look at, and of course I'm no longer a young man, I'm in my mid-70s, so certain issues are much more pressing. There's a lot of suffering that comes from just the fact that we're animals in existence, and animals go through not even evolution, but transitions from birth through growing up, so to speak, or maturing, having to deal with survival. And then if they do manage to survive, face the inevitability of the decay of the body. And nature is not too kindly to that. And as human beings, we also have this well-developed mind, which in some ways, I think, is a twist of odd fate of nature. I mean, some people might see it as the necessary result of complexity in molecular biology or in genetics. The DNA would have produced this mind, but I think not. I think it is not just a simple accident of nature, but one of the many odd outcomes of nature that aren't too efficient and manage to help the beings that possess them survive a little better than other beings around them. But that doesn't mean they're that well formed. This is topic of the first book I wrote on Buddha and Darwin. So here we are. I'm sitting here looking out the window at the redwood trees in my front yard and the sun going down on the opposite side. And it's actually, it's exquisite. It's beyond exquisite. It has a kind of profound beauty to it. But if you look at it closely, there are insects on the trees devouring other insects, and the trees are eating my septic system with their roots. And, as long as the town doesn't get word of it, I'm fine. And my body is aging. I watched my father's generation go. I was born in a depression and war. The number of wars in my life is uncountable. The misery that they produce, I can hardly conceive. And is that different than, I don't know, the cat that's probably hunting a bird in my yard at the moment, my predatory neighbor's cat, who may play with the bird and not really eat it, but let its life linger out of some cat-like behavior, which to us looks a little bit analogous to what we do to other human beings. And for me, meditation is the only way to really take this all in. Without meditation, I think it would be very hard for me to look at existence, not only all those natural things out there that happen independent of me, independent of human civilization, but the kinds of things that occur within human society, that meditation not only supplies a way of looking at them without any shades on your eyes, without any illusions as to what it really is, and to live with it and live with the challenges of it. So for me, it's been a crucial part of my life in the last 35, 40 years. And it's a refuge, but it doesn't erase the reality. It doesn't romanticize it. It makes it clear, and it gives me a tool to face it unblinkingly, although I must say I do blink a lot.
So let's take that as a segue, Charlie, into just a brief discussion of your book, Dismantling Discontent, Buddha's Way Through Darwin's World. As I was mentioning before we started the interview, as you and I were talking, it's a book that I've had sitting next to my couch that I take a look at fairly frequently because it has this very nice appealing blend for me as a student of biology and evolution, and how this ties into what we're seeing in our practice. So tell us a little bit more about that book and what prompted you to write it.
Well, I'm not trained as a biologist, never took a biology course in my life. I'm really sad that I never did. But I became interested in nature in the late 60s in order to kind of share something with a younger brother who had been much oppressed by being held up to my standard in the family. even though he wasn't an intellectual and not a scholar. So I decided to join in something that he did well himself and that I didn't know much about. And so I went for a canoeing trip with him in the Arctic in 1969, and it blew my fuses. It absolutely blew my fuses. I mean, the stark emptiness of the barren grounds in northern Canada, the fact that we had only ourselves to rely on to survive. I mean, we did have an aluminum canoe, and we did have a shotgun in case grizzly bears bothered us. But it was very empty, very unlike Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I lived, and very unlike the life I led in the university. And when I got home to Cambridge after a month on a river in the Arctic, I couldn't go out. I mean, I was in shell shock. And over the next, dozen years or so, I spent more and more time in nature. I wanted to learn more and more about it. I began teaching courses on environmental history and human beings' relationship to nature. I was a professor of sociology, and anything goes in sociology. And I also began meditating, and the two themes wove through my life. And at some point, someone asked me to do a workshop. And, I didn't know what to do it on, a Buddhist workshop. And a friend of mine, Rodney Smith, who teaches up in meditation in Seattle, said to me, "But you know so much about nature." And the proverbial light bulb went up in my head. And I began to really think about what the relationship between nature and meditation was. And it became clear to me that we were creatures of nature. And if meditation was anything, it was part of our being creatures of nature. And I wanted to find out what part that was. And so I began to think about disease, old age, and death. How did they exist in nature? Did we experience it the same as other animals? And so there's a chapter in the book on the natural history of disease, old age, and death, and another chapter of how those peculiarly happened to human beings. So, for instance, most of us get arthritis when we're old. Most of us do. If you live long enough, you're going to get arthritis. And it may not bother you, but for most people over 75 or 80, arthritis is a factor in their life. Well, wolves get arthritis. That's what mammals get when they get old, except wolves don't live as long as we do in terms of their lifespan. If we had a lot of old wolves around, we would have a lot of arthritic old wolves. So, the same thing. How does death happen? How does disease happen? And then why do we experience it in a peculiar way, not only physically peculiar? For instance, our kidneys fail. You can't kill a rat by getting its kidneys to fail. Rats die usually pretty horrible death. You don't find old rats around occasionally because other rats end up getting them. So, but we get sick and medicine keeps us alive. So I wanted to look at this whole picture: disease, old age, and death, its challenges. How did it change for us as we went from being hunter-gatherers and being more like the rats and the wolves to living in agricultural society, and then to live in this post-industrial society where our bodies are no longer as relevant and our minds are engaged in ways that one could never have conceived in Buddha's time, such as your iPhone and, Skype now, and I can see a picture of you. And that's really strange. I mean, it's really strange since human beings only connected to each other in a face-to-face way for years. So how can we understand the nature of our suffering or the character of our suffering as part of nature, and how has that changed as we have changed the world around us. As we no longer live in the woods, we no longer have to hunt and gather on a daily basis in order to survive. And I can walk to my freezer and choose 50 different meals, or in households now where people don't eat together, whereas eating together in most hunter-gatherer societies was a crucial piece of their connectedness. And so that's what that book is about. And in some ways, that book has said, as we denature ourselves, we increase our suffering. And the remedies that the Buddha offered to address that suffering are vastly more relevant in a deeper way now than they might have been in a hunter-gatherer society. We know of no hunter-gatherer societies that meditated the way the Buddha did, right? That addressed suffering in the way he did. And it's not that they couldn't look at it in other ways, nor had an idea very much of karma the way he did. But that's a very highly disputed point. So that book was to lay out human beings as aspects of nature, lay out meditation. There's a whole business on neurophysiology and stuff like that, and what goes on in our brains as we meditate. Very popular subject nowadays, and I have a very different take on it than do the people that want to convince you that science proves that meditation is right. I don't think that's the case, though one could go into it. It's a hot topic. Anyway, so that's what that book is about. And it ends with a quote from Ajahn Sumedho, student of Ajahn Chah's, and a man who ran a monastery in England for years and now is retired, I think, in Thailand. And he said the modern world, and Ajahn Chah said this too in a different way, our living in the modern world is like sticking your fingers in an electric socket. In other words, all those things out there are energizing your nervous system and the way your mind works way, way beyond what it was that nature produced our bodies to do. And so it's a deep challenge. I tried to frame the problem in dismantling discontent. I don't think I've solved it, because we're not about to let go of those things in the society that so short-circuit our nervous systems. And we have to live with the consequences of it. And those are unclear at the moment.
So let's talk about your new book, which is Meditation in the Wilds, Recluses, Hermits, and Forest Monks. Tell us about that. Tell us about getting back to that more natural way of doing this practice.
Well, that was the title I gave to the book. The publisher decided on a different one. Just like having your fingers in the electric socket when you engage with publishers, you need to bend to their will. The title of the book is now Meditation in the Wild, Buddhism's Origin in the Heart of Nature. So the title is a little bit of a misnomer because it's highly debatable what role the aspects of nature played in early Buddhism versus aspects of civilization. And I have an unpublished dialogue with Stephen Batchelor about this, since he opts for civilization. But he's a very civilized man, wonderful, wonderful Buddhist scholar and intellectual, one of my great heroes. And it's a privilege to be able to talk with him, as does Bhikkhu Bodhi, the famous translator of the sutras. They all believe that civilization is the most important ingredient in the origins of Buddhism. I don't. I think nature is the most important ingredient, but it's a conversation. I'm not sure any of us are right or wrong, or that there is the evidence to prove it one way. But Meditation in the Wild was the second half of dismantling discontent. In other words, I wanted to look at the whole natural historical aspect of Buddhism and how meditation works and what meditation does and how our society has changed the nature of the challenge. And then I wanted to look at the guys that said, hey, we turn our back on it all. The Buddha in many places talks about the way in which society, our addiction to society, our engagement in society, adds to our suffering. And I don't mean what I'm going to say now quite literally, but when I sat with Ajahn Chah, Jack Kornfield's teacher, the famous forest monk, and someone said, hey, he's a monastic, right? Someone said, what about marriage and family, right? And Ajahn Chah looked at the person. I mean, Ajahn Chah's not the best person in the world to ask about marriage and family because he's never experienced them. But he turned to them and said, do you want to have manacles around your legs? Those things are fine, but understand it will add to the challenges of what meditation is aiming towards. The way the Buddha said, hey, go away from all the distractions, right? And then you can do the practice more purely. Then the distractions will overwhelm you. So the Buddha himself went off in the jungle, not to escape the distractions, but that was the path that people took once he left his pleasure palaces. You went off with all the wandering sannyasins, and at India at the time, there were apparently a lot of them. And he used that setting to get a clearer idea of the nature of suffering and set a tradition of people doing the same thing. There were several forest monks at the time of the Buddha. And the Buddha said, and here's where the civilization versus the wilds gets undecidable, let's say. He said, it's not a path for everyone. If you do not have the right disposition, the forests will whirl away your mind, and it'll be more destructive for you. So this gives us the dual path of the monastery monks and the forest monks. And I knew nothing about Buddhist ideology. I knew nothing about Buddhist history when I started this all. But then when I started tracking down after I immersed myself in evolution and neurophysiology and natural history of disease, old age, and death, I then turned to explore the guys that went off in the woods. And they weren't all guys. The first ones were apparently women. But then the establishment became too nervous with the women out in the woods and forbade them to go. But the poems of the elder nuns really give wonderful hints of women going off in nature to meditate. So here, men and women going off in nature. What did they understand about nature? What were the challenges? How did nature help them with their meditation practice? So that whole picture. And I looked at ancient India, the time of the Buddha. Then I looked at China, where there were recluses. In each country, they had slightly different names. And the recluses were the people that turned their back on Chinese civilization. I mean, we think of Chinese civilization as nature-friendly, but in fact, it was one of the most hostile civilizations to nature that has ever existed on the earth. And some of the current problems in China reflect that. So the recluses in China not only had to deal with this overweening civilization, but with nature in China itself. And there were some wonderful ones. I mean, the thing about Mahayana Buddhism in China and Japan is it used poetry and painting to express some of the stuff, since it had a certain hostility to linear thought. Zen is always, or it was called Chan in China, had a certain hostility to linear thought. Not that they didn't engage in it. So these guys that went off away from the Tao, from the Confucian order of civilization, they expressed a lot of their experiences in poetry and painting. Well, I mean, the Chinese were great historians. The Indians were terrible historians. They somehow didn't believe in history, whereas the Chinese made chronicles and really kept track of the transformations of their civilization. And, a lot of it was not very nice. There was a lot of starvation and incredible violence in China. And Buddhism took root in the suffering in China, a lot in the suffering. And so the Confucian ideas of order and responsibility and family, kind of akin to Ajahn Chah's thing about getting married, did not give a sort of a peace to these searching Buddhist monks. And so they went off in the woods and they said, we're not going to have anything to do with it. And some of their expressions of what they did were beautiful. And we get some idea of what their experience was like and what nature taught them. And then Japan, where this tradition came to even greater fruition, the Japanese were much closer to nature than the Chinese. And when Buddhism came, it was a very elite thing. It took a long time for it to sink down into the peasantry in Japan. And those people had Shinto gods of everything. So they were really attuned to nature, and they hooked the two things together. And so the hermits in Japan had wonderful expressions of what it was like to go off in the mountains and meditate. And unlike the Theravadan monks in ancient India, they grew their own vegetables and they gathered in the woods herbs and medicines and things to eat and berries. So there's a very rich picture, particularly expressed in poetry in Japan, of forest practice. And that influenced people in the United States like Gary Snyder, and the Chinese Recluses influenced a wonderful translator of Chinese Zen masters, a man by the name of White Pine, Bill Porter. And some of that got carried over, particularly in Gary's poetry and in some of his translations. So we got a taste of that in this country, and that has inspired many people here. Finally, there were the resurgence of the forest monk monastic tradition in Thailand in the late 19th century, and it lasted until the Vietnam War, when it was wiped out by the Vietnam military trying to get the communists. And that tradition seems to be almost exactly the same as the tradition was in India at the time of the Buddha. Guys really went off into the jungles, and there are biographies of them, and they sat with tigers. Ajahn Mahabua, if you look at a picture of him, I think he's dead now, or he must be very ancient if he's not. You look at a picture of this guy meditating, and you know that he sat with tigers and with raging elephants, and it became a crucial part of his practice. And it became what he taught. So some of that was around, although like Ajahn Chah, the forest aspect of it wasn't much conveyed to the Western students of those monks in Thailand who had lived as forest monks before the Westerners arrived at the time of the Vietnam War and afterwards and began to sit with them. So that's the book. It ends with anecdotes about my time in the woods and stories about bears. And it ends with a discussion of three people who now lead wilderness or nature retreats and how that might find expression in the modern world in which we live.
So Charlie, what were some of your most memorable experiences during this exploration of the creative process?
I'm a trained scientist, and I always had a really hard time writing, and I really wanted to be a historian, but I couldn't read and write well enough to do that. So I became a mathematician instead, although I didn't survive very long as a mathematician, ended up being a sociologist. And sociologists don't speak or write in English very much. And I really wanted to write. And this book has been a process of learning how to write. The two books. I now write a great deal and write history and all kinds of things. Getting published is another thing. But what I discovered is, first, I love doing the research. I loved walking into libraries and tracking down people and doing interviews, something I did when I was a scholar. And so the process of thinking it all out, I mean, the two books were 10 years in the writing at least, and the process of thinking it out and understanding that I could use my own experience to reveal what it was that the forest monks were doing. I mean, they were very cryptic, but as Gary Snyder recognizes when he writes about the hermits in Japan, from his own experiences in life, he can dig through what was really authentic and what was a pose. Most Chinese recluses were posing. Most Chinese landscapers were posing. They had little experience about nature themselves. They were Confucians who who lived a pretty high life. And what I discovered when I closely looked at what the hermits in Japan were doing, I could recognize from my own experience and practice the authenticity and depth of what they conveyed. I mean, I'm kind of a scholar, and my books are linear. I don't really like to write about my own experiences, but my editors and my publishers made me do that. And I think they're right in a way that you can illuminate practice that is expressed in other people's writing and painting and stuff like that. You can illuminate that with your own practice and talk about that in a way that's as close to your being as you can make it. And so those were the creative challenges.
Charlie, what do you hope readers get out of this book most?
Well, both the books, I want them to shock people. I want people to not take the worlds around them for granted. And I think going into nature or looking at the character of natural history, of being eaten in the wild, can really shock you into seeing how different the world you live is from your ideas of it. And not only encourage people to meditate, which I hope the books do, show them the richness in meditation and how much you can learn about yourself, but also how much you can learn about how you take for granted the ways that you're embedded in the world. And if you really look at them, they're somewhat strange, and they have ramifications that add to the suffering in life. And if you can step back using practice and using the observation of life. And I don't mean just human life, I mean all of life. Then that can give you a lever for teasing apart the ways in which we are blind to how our lives affect not only the natural world, but each other. And we need more than ever to have our eyes open on that, to have the shades fall away from our eyes and look at things really clearly. And I think we will make healthier choices if we do.
For people who are listening to the podcast, you can find out more about Charlie's work at dismantlingdiscontent.com. Our guest today, Charlie Fisher. Charlie, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site, on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.